Hello, SFS alumni around the world. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and I am very excited to be able to host another edition of our Fast Break, our special series, engaging with SFS alumni around the world on issues that are at the top of the news agenda. And obviously, this week, everyone has been talking about the crisis in Venezuela, and our role today is to talk about what's next for Venezuela. And we could not be happier to have an alumni, a son of Georgetown, Todd Robinson from the class of '85 at SFS, who has had an extraordinary career of service to this country, leading to the highest rank in the State Department of Career Ambassador, long service across the world, but in particular in Central America. He ended up as Assistant Secretary of State for international narcotics and law enforcement affairs in the previous administration, but he's been a senior advisor for Central America. And of course, for this conversation, he served as Chargé d'Affaires in Caracas in 2017 and 2018, and he had the honor of being expelled by President Maduro. So he knows what of he speaks. So we're going to ask him a few questions, just a couple of ground rules for the conversation today. I will be monitoring the Q&A function throughout the conversation. I will be essentially integrating your questions. I won't be calling out particular questions by name, but I will integrating your questions into our conversation. And I also want to let you know that the entire conversation will be recorded and put on the SFS YouTube channel, along with all of our fast breaks, which we've been getting great hits and views across our SFS community. So, Ambassador Robinson, Todd, welcome back to Georgetown. It's great to have you here. Thanks for being with us. Look, I really want to think forward-looking and talk about really what is next for Venezuela. So we got to start by telling us something about this interim president, Delcy Rodríguez. Tell us what you know about Delcy Rodríguez. Tell us your impressions of the position that she is in at the moment, and just any other observations about her pathway forward.
Sure. First of all, Hoya Saxa. Let me get that out there now. Um, I had the opportunity to meet Delcy Rodríguez a couple of times when I was in Venezuela. I know her to be a strong believer in this Bolivarian system that they've created. I think she is in many ways Machiavellian in her way, in the way that she and her brother Jorge have moved their way up the ranks to be among the closest advisors to Nicolás Maduro. I think you're absolutely right. She's in a very tough position. One, because it is not clear to me that Diosdado Cabello, one of the other sort of heads of the Hydra that run this organization, this government, or General Padrino Lopez, the defense secretary, another important power sector running this organization. It's not clear to me that either one of them are on board with her. And that's really important because they control the intelligence network, they control the weapons. And Delcy does not control either one of those. So if those two other power sectors are not in some way brought into this equation, it's going to be really hard for her to comply with whatever guarantees she's giving the Trump administration. And then the other part of this, real quick, that I think is really important is in 2024 there was an election. And ordinary Venezuelans, went to the ballot box, and in the face of incredible corruption of the electoral system, voted overwhelmingly for democratic change. How that is not being accounted for, or maybe it is being accounted for by the Trump administration, I think is a real problem. In the press conference they did at the White House, the Democratic opposition was thrown under the bus. I great sympathy for them, and I hope they find some way to bring them into the equation as well.
Well, I'm going to ask you about that in a bit, but I want to go further into your discussion of the Hydra that actually does control power in Venezuela. What have we heard from the other branches of power in Venezuela? What are they saying? What are they doing? What evidence do we have that they are part and parcel of any kind of agreement, discussion, negotiation that has been going on between the Trump administration and the government of Venezuela?
Well, I obviously I'm not in the administration, so I don't know for sure, but I think that they have to have been brought into the conversation. Both Padrino Lopez, from what I'm hearing on the ground, from my contacts on the ground, both Padrino Lopez and Diosdado Cabello were at the inauguration ceremony that, funny enough, was presided over by Nicolás Maduro's son, another part of this head of this Hydra that's out there. They were at the inauguration, but it is still, it's not clear to me that they've reached an agreement either with Delcy and Jorge or with the Trump administration. The collectivos are still out there terrorizing people on the one hand, but they've let some political prisoners out of the prison on the other hand. So I think it's a very fast moving, very fluid situation right now. And, I'm looking at this from the outside like you are. I suspect they're having those conversations, but I don't know that for a fact.
What do you think is the nature of the conversations? I mean, I know that you're not part of it, but there does seem we obviously have the rhetoric that Donald Trump has made saying we are in control, we're in charge, we're making the decisions. On the one hand, one could argue that they learned the lessons of Iraq by not completely decapitating and destroying the existing power structures that existed and relying upon them. On the other hand, with the rhetoric that Donald Trump has put out there about essentially imperialist style rhetoric of we are in charge, how does Delcy manage that tension? Because she's got to obviously keep her constituencies happy, both the power constituencies as well as public opinion in Venezuela, although I'm sure not the support for Maduro does not go as deep, perhaps, as maybe some suspect. But I wonder how she manages this kind of tension of keeping people on side while dealing with this very, very strong rhetoric about external control.
No, I think you're right. I imagine Delcy sort of juggling all of these balls. And I have to say, I've said this publicly as well. The messaging out of the White House has been atrocious on this. I think they have really they have focused on the forceful, muscular public messaging rather than the more nuanced, giving them space to operate messaging that they really need to have to make this a success. I think so. That's one part. I think the other part is, Venezuela is a large country, 30 million people, 8 million Venezuelans outside of Venezuela. It is really hard. I think it's virtually impossible for the United States to sort of run Venezuela from a boat off the coast of Venezuela, much less from Washington, D.C. by telephone or, by Zoom or whatever. I think all of that is going to be really, really hard. But the other thing I would say about Delcy is if anybody can manage those pieces, she's the kind of person who can. She is Machiavellian in that way that she plays people. The regime has been playing the United States and the international community off for almost 3 decades. Giving in some areas, taking away in others. So they know how to do this. They've been masters of this for a long time, and she's been part of that mastery.
Well, can you tell me what levers of control do you think the United States can exercise
Mm.
in terms of shaping the outcomes of Venezuelan politics going forward? We've heard a lot, of course, about oil and the transshipment of oil and whether the oil is coming to the United States. We've heard the threat point of potential boots on the ground, as Donald Trump has mentioned. What do you think are reasonable levers that America will exercise in trying to shape outcomes in Venezuela?
Well, I have to believe that nothing is off the table, right? I mean, we saw what they did with Nicolás Maduro, so the extraction threat is out there. Ordinarily, I would have said, if this was any other president, I would have said, okay, we've got to get in there quickly. We've got to work on security for ordinary Venezuelans. We need to come in with an economic development package. You know, get our best analysts and diplomats back on the ground. We got to open up the embassy. We got to do all these things to get back in the game. We don't have those levers anymore, right? We've taken AID off the table completely. So getting an economic package on the ground, all of those experts are gone. All of that money is gone. The pipeline in order to do that is gone. So really, what we have is the tough talk and the fact that we can pivot maybe to some of the other power centers in Venezuela, and we can, even though we've insulted them and denigrated them publicly, we could always turn to the Democratic opposition. That is another lever. At the end of the day, it's incumbent upon the current junta or regime to have support from Washington, because it would be very easy to begin to foment unrest in Venezuela from various different sectors, including, if Padrino Lopez isn't on board and Diosdado isn't on board, bringing them in to play them off against Delcy and Jorge. So, I mean, there's a constellation of things out there, and it's a fast-moving situation.
Well, one of the biggest risks you mentioned in how this is going to play itself out is what happens at the popular level, what happens among the public. We've had several questions asking about, we've talked a lot about how the leadership of the different power centers might be viewing this. What do you sense in terms of public opinion? What's the likely possibility that this could lead to large-scale protests or other forms of popular action that might make Venezuela ungovernable under the current circumstances?
Well, so I've been in contact with people on the ground, friends of mine, former staffers at the embassy, and I think what you're finding inside Venezuela is what you're finding outside Venezuela, from ordinary Venezuelans, and that is one, absolute joy that Nicolás Maduro is gone. I mean, let's be clear. There's very little crying for Nicolás Maduro. He presided over a regime that visited unimaginable human rights abuses against his own people. So, there's no sympathy for him. On the other hand, because it's hard for people to understand who is exactly is in charge, there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of apprehension. Ordinary people that are trying to go to the grocery store are wondering, who are these people on the corner? Some of them with guns, some of them, looking like they're with the intelligence apparatus. Some of them might be in the opposition. It's just hard to tell. So I think there is, absolute joy on the one hand, but I think that's very much tempered with anxiety about what comes next.
Well, tell us how you see the Democratic opposition maneuvering. How are they reacting to what's happening? What's happening on the ground with the Democratic opposition? And how do you see that part playing out? We had lots of questions about what that would mean for the Democratic forces.
Well, I've been in touch with some members of the Democratic opposition, and again, I think they on the one hand overjoyed that Nicolás Maduro is gone, but again, I think they are also anxious about the way they have been portrayed by the Trump administration publicly. I'm sure they are trying to have conversations with people in the White House about what the future might look like. My understanding is the president has stated that he's going to meet at some point with Maria Corina Machado and perhaps the person I consider to be the president-elect, Edmundo Gonzalez. But they know that any chance they have of getting back into a leadership position right now goes through the White House. So while they may be apprehensive about the way they're being portrayed, I'm sure they probably don't feel they're in a position to publicly say that. I can say that because I'm not going to be in that position of running the country, but I think they're going to be a lot more reticent about saying what they really feel because they know the Trump administration is pulling a lot of the strings here.
Well, what do you think are the Trump administration's next move? We've had several questions about it. And one question in particular interesting because you served in the first Trump administration. So you were in the Trump administration. Obviously, lots of differences between the first and the second Trump administrations. What do you see as the differences? What's changed? And what do you really see as Trump's likely next move?
Well, so again, I go back to the messaging. I think the way they did this was really, really sort of improvised, uh, flying by the seat of their pants. The first argument they made for this operation was drug trafficking. And let's be clear, very little of the drugs that were entering the United States were coming from Venezuela directly. Venezuela was a transshipment point. Drugs were coming from Colombia, going across the border. They were flown from Venezuela through Central America to Central America, unloaded, put in cars, driven across through Mexico to the southwest border. Like 95% of the drugs were coming that way. They were either coming up from South America or being flown through from Venezuela. Maybe 3, 4, 5% coming directly from Venezuela. Then the second argument they were making was this is about democratic transition. That moved really quickly. To the third argument, which didn't seem to fly, from the second argument that didn't seem to fly, to the third argument, which was oil. It seems to me that this White House is focusing on the oil aspect. And I have to say, from what I know about the oil industry in Venezuela, again, having been there on the ground, that's going to be a long-term proposition. The Venezuelan oil is what's called heavy crude. It's hard to get out of the ground. The infrastructure in Venezuela has been in decline and decay for the better part of 2 decades. So it's not going to be hard to do. And the oil is not user-friendly. It all has to be heavily refined, much of which was happening in the United States. So you have that oil, that aspect of it. But the other aspect is there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of big and small cases from the nationalizations that took place of the oil industry back in the 70s and the 80s and the early 2000s that have to be litigated. And unless the United States is going to say, we are going to make all of the past litigants whole, those cases still have to be decided in court, which is both international court and domestic court in the United States. All of that is going to take a lot of time. I think the most conservative estimates are years, not months, before anybody sees any economic benefit, which is why certainly U.S. companies, but even international companies, which I think the president's going to meet with later today, are wary about getting back in the game in Venezuela. I think all of this is going to take a lot more time than the administration is letting on.
But if there is, and one of the questions asked about this, if there is no short-term peace dividend, because as you're saying, these investments are going to take a long time to produce any significant investments in the Venezuelan economy. I don't know what's happening with the blockade and whether or not that could, create some short-term benefits. But the concern might be that in the absence of any real dividends from the ouster of Maduro, who you say was deeply unpopular, but if it's not leading to any tangible economic benefits publicly, is there a possibility that we just see some eruption at the popular level that ultimately is going to require some form of what Trump said is possible, boots on the ground?
I think it's possible. I mean, this is why I think the pivot away from democratic transition was the wrong move, because you could have gotten some really important quick hits if you'd gone in with a development assistance package, an economic reform package, and a security package. Those three things immediately, if those had been lined up and ready to go after Maduro was taken off the stage, then you could have gotten some immediate short-term benefit. Because this is what AID used to do. This is what INL, the bureau I ran, used to do. This is what, the Treasury Department and Justice, DHS, this is what we do. And we could have done it very, very quickly if all of that had been lined up quickly, and we get the embassy open again quickly. You could have had those short-term benefits. Now, I think it's really hard to see where they go on the financial side if they're going to focus on oil. Maybe there are other parts of the financial picture that they're looking at, but if you're going to focus on oil, I think that's a long-term proposition.
Well, let me pivot now to ask the broader implications of this. First of all, there's been a lot of concerns about Chinese, Russian, Cuban, even Hezbollah rumor engagements in Venezuela. What do you think the implications are for those players? How serious were those concerns? And is there really a significant sort of shift? And then we're going to close with some regional implications within Central America.
Sure. Well, let's be clear. The Chinese, Russian, to a certain extent, the Islamic terrorist threats were real in Venezuela. I think this action has actually given Russia and China license to do similar operations in in what they consider to be their areas of influence, which could trigger, other unstable movements on their part, say in Europe or in Asia. So, we are really playing a very dangerous game here in that respect.
But keeping the focus, keeping the focus on Latin America. How do you sort of see? I mean, this is going to have implications for Colombia. It's going to have implications for Cuba. It's going to have implications for China's role in Latin America, Russia's role perhaps in Latin America. What do you see as the regional implications of this that perhaps the Trump administration hasn't fully kind of brought into their calculations?
Well,
Or
what I
maybe they
would
have,
say.
incidentally. They may indeed have.
Yeah, no, I think they have. I think you are seeing from the messaging again, I think you're seeing very much that this is how they want to be seen. And what I would say is, look, I'm a diplomat, right? Um, I feel like we got a lot more cooperation and collaboration by putting out our hand and saying we're here to help rather than trying to bully countries into doing what we want them to do. We need Mexico and Colombia if we're going to be serious about fighting drug trafficking in the United States. Colombia, people I think, don't understand this, but over the past 3 decades, Colombia has become one of our closest security allies, not just in the hemisphere, but around the world. I was using Colombian trainers in Africa and in Asia to help them fight the Mexican cartels and the influence of Colombian traffickers in those regions. And they were willing to do it because we were partners, because we were allies. I think countries in the region are looking at how the United States has treated Canada, how the United States has treated Mexico, how the United States is treating Denmark and Greenland, and they're saying, what the heck is going on? How are we going to protect ourselves from a possible whack across the head from this administration? And you're seeing, two extreme examples of that, right? The Argentines of the world with their new government, Ecuador, Chile, they're rah-rah on board. But you're seeing questions from countries like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. They are much less on board with what's happening, knowing full well that they are also pretty happy that Nicolás Maduro is off the table at the moment.
So talk a little bit more about Cuba, though. What's the narrative in Cuba, and how do you see this playing out in Cuba?
Yeah, I think Cuba is really interesting, right? I think because they were a ward of Venezuela economically, even though they were very much behind the intelligence and security apparatus in Venezuela on that end. If they're no longer receiving the economic benefits of a relationship in Cuba from Venezuela, that puts them in a very, very difficult position. They've become less of a economic dependent from Russia. They're no longer getting the oil and economic support from Venezuela. That's going to make things harder for the regime in Cuba. And, as we see in Iran, as we possibly could see in Venezuela, I think we could see the beginnings of protests in Cuba if the social economic situation gets worse.
Well, one last question, and this is going to have to be brief. But as you look over the next 2 to 3 weeks, tell me, what signal will you look at to say this is moving in a better direction than you had expected? And what signal would tell you that this is moving in a worse direction than you expected?
Well, the first signal is already there now, potentially. The release of political prisoners was key. And I'm not sure how many were released, but the regime was holding up to 800 political prisoners. So I think, that's a clear sign that some kind of negotiation is moving in the right direction in Venezuela. I think if we start seeing violence from the colectivos, I think if you start seeing protests from ordinary Venezuelans about the situation, then I think things are going in the wrong direction. And if whatever comes from this meeting at the White House with the oil companies, if they are like gung ho and ready to go, I think that's, all things being equal, a positive sign. But if, as I suspect, you're going to see, a little wariness about getting in there, and they want to see, they and their lawyers want to see the small print on some of these contracts, then I think we're going to, it's going to be much more of a long-term proposition than an immediate proposition.
Well, thanks for those pointers to give you a sense of where things might be going. Todd, Ambassador Robinson, thank you so much for spending a half hour with us and our SFS community. We had a great attendance around the world, great questions, And we really appreciate your insights into this. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, SFS alums, for being part of our community and joining us on our fast breaks. As I said, we try to do this occasionally when big things happen in the world, but we tend to be doing them quite a bit these days. So I suspect we'll see you on screen again in the coming weeks as we follow this situation. And I know there were questions about Taiwan and Greenland and other situations that might be impacted by this set of decisions. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Robinson, for being part of this. And do check us out on YouTube if you want to follow this and other fast breaks going forward. Thank you very much. All the best to you all.
Take care. Hoya Saxa.